In my first life, my sister and I were promised into the Ashcroft family on the same afternoon, seated across from men who spoke gently while deciding things that could not be undone. Their voices smooth with inherited confidence. Their smiles practiced in the way that suggested they had never needed to ask for permission. The Ashcrofts were old wealth, the kind that didn't chase publicity or favor, the kind that reshaped systems quietly and let others take credit for the results. And when they chose brides, it was not romance they were selecting for, but tolerance, adaptability, and the ability to remain silent when silence was required. My sister Lillian believed this room had been built for her. She sat straighter, smiled wider, and spoke with an ease that suggested she already saw herself reflected in their polished surfaces. I, on the other hand, watched hands, pauses, the slight shifts in posture when certain names were spoken, and learned more in that hour than Lillian ever would. There were two sons, as there always are in stories like this, and from the moment introductions were made it was clear which one my sister wanted. Charles Ashcroft, the elder, was warmth wrapped in precision, charming without effort, generous in ways that drew attention, his presence filling the room as though he had been trained from birth to occupy space without apology. Lillian leaned toward him instinctively, laughter spilling easily from her lips, already weaving herself into his orbit as though proximity alone were a promise. That left Matthew Ashcroft, the younger, seated slightly apart, his attention drifting not from disinterest but from restraint, his gaze observant rather than inviting, the kind of man who listened for what wasn't said and remembered it later. Lillian described him afterward as uncomfortable, as if that were an insult rather than a warning, and told me with a conspiratorial smile that she would never allow herself to be trapped by someone so cold. In my previous life, she succeeded. The weddings were held 6 months apart, hers first and loudly celebrated, mine later and with far less ceremony, and the contrast was not accidental. Lillian thrived initially, basking in attention, entertaining endlessly, spending lavishly, her image polished and circulated until she became synonymous with the Ashcroft name in public imagination. I lived more quietly with Matthew, learning his rhythms, discovering that distance could be a form of respect, and that control, when not weaponized, could feel like safety. He never restricted me, never demanded affection, never raised his voice, but his expectations were precise, and I met them willingly because clarity, I learned, was its own kind of mercy. The weddings were held 6 months apart, hers first and loudly celebrated, mine later and with far less ceremony, and the contrast was not accidental. Lillian thrived initially, basking in attention, entertaining endlessly, spending lavishly, her image polished and circulated until she became synonymous with the Ashcroft name in public imagination. I lived more quietly with Matthew, learning his rhythms, discovering that distance could be a form of respect, and that control, when not weaponized, could feel like safety. He never restricted me, never demanded affection, never raised his voice, but his expectations were precise, and I met them willingly because clarity, I learned, was its own kind of mercy. What unraveled Lillian was not cruelty but absence. Charles was adored by the world, and the world took him everywhere, leaving Lillian alone in rooms that grew too large too quickly, her reflection the only audience left to admire her. She filled the silence the only way she knew how, louder gestures, sharper demands, risks taken for attention rather than reward, until the mistakes began accumulating faster than Charles was willing to conceal them. Arguments followed, then reconciliations, each one thinner than the last, until something shifted permanently behind closed doors, and Lillian's smile acquired a tension that no amount of luxury could smooth away. The night she killed me, there was no shouting. She invited me to the upper terrace under the pretense of reconciliation, spoke softly about family, about betrayal, about how unfair it was that some people survived by being unremarkable, while others were consumed by wanting too much. The city spread beneath us like a field of stars, indifferent and vast, and when her hands pressed against my back, there was a steadiness to them that suggested she had rehearsed the motion long before committing to it. I remember thinking distantly that this was the only decisive thing she had ever done. When I opened my eyes again, I was sitting in that same room where agreements were made, sunlight slanting across the table at the same unforgiving angle, Lillian beside me once more, her fingers tapping just slightly too fast against her knee. The second life announced itself not with panic but with clarity. And when our gazes met, her pupils dilated, the mask slipping just enough for me to know she remembered too. The difference this time was that she did not hesitate. Before anyone could finish outlining expectations, she turned sharply, smiled at me with manufactured warmth, and declared that she believed I would be far better suited to Matthew, that his temperament required someone unassuming, someone flexible, someone who would not challenge him unnecessarily. I agreed. I lowered my eyes, murmured gratitude, and accepted Matthew's hand when it was offered, feeling the subtle tension in his grip as he realized the decision had been maneuvered rather than arrived at organically. Across the room, Charles laughed and pulled Lillian toward him, already distracted, already pleased, and I understood then that she believed she had just secured her future while discarding mine. What she could not see, what she had never been able to see, was that Matthew's silence was not emptiness but containment, and that what he contained, once aligned with intent, did not loosen its hold easily. This time I would not fall. This time I would let the room do what it had always done best. Marriage to Matthew Ashcroft did not arrive with spectacle or celebration, but with a quiet efficiency that felt almost surgical. Documents signed, dates confirmed, expectations clarified in private rather than announced publicly, and I understood quickly that this was how he preferred all meaningful transitions to occur, without witnesses who might later misremember or distort what had been agreed upon. We moved into a residence that had been maintained rather than lived in, rooms curated for function rather than comfort, every object placed deliberately and never moved without reason. And in that space, I learned the precise contours of Matthew's attention, how it sharpened when something interested him and withdrew entirely when it did not. How he catalogued people the way others catalogued assets, not by how they made him feel, but by what they were capable of becoming under the right pressure. He asked very little of me explicitly, but the unspoken expectations were exacting, and I met them with care, observing first, adapting second, making myself useful in ways that did not announce themselves as ambition. Lillian, meanwhile, was loud enough for both of us. She threw herself into her role beside Charles with the same hunger she had always mistaken for confidence, hosting gatherings that grew more extravagant with each passing month, surrounding herself with people who praised her taste, her presence, her indispensability, and mistaking that noise for influence. Charles indulged her publicly, his arm always around her waist, his smile practiced and convincing, but the indulgence came with conditions she never quite noticed until they were enforced, and the more she pushed against them, the more his patience thinned. Their home became a stage where everything was curated for appearance, arguments postponed until doors closed, resentment stored carefully and released in intervals that left no visible marks but altered the way Lillian moved through rooms, more cautiously now, her laughter arriving a fraction of a second too late. What shifted the balance was not scandal but competence. Matthew began inviting me to sit in on discussions that were not meant for spouses, framing it as convenience, as efficiency, as an acknowledgement of my background rather than a concession of authority. And I listened while men with decades of experience spoke carelessly, revealing assumptions they believed no one would challenge. I asked questions that appeared innocuous but exposed weaknesses in projections, contradictions in timelines, risks that had been intentionally minimized to protect reputations rather than outcomes. And each time Matthew watched without interruption, allowing the silence after my observations to do its work. Decisions began to change subtly, strategies adjusted, names reassigned, and though no one credited me openly, invitations followed, then expectations, then reliance. Lillian noticed the distance widening before she understood its cause. She complained that people no longer returned her calls with the same urgency, that meetings were scheduled without consulting her availability, that Charles seemed increasingly distracted, his focus elsewhere even when physically present. She blamed exhaustion, then jealousy, then conspiracy, cycling through explanations that absolved her of responsibility while deepening her isolation. When she confronted me, her tone was casual but her eyes sharp. She asked whether I had noticed how cold Matthew could be, whether I ever felt diminished by his indifference, whether I ever wondered what it would be like to be seen the way she was seen. I answered carefully, truthfully but selectively, telling her that visibility was not the same as security, and that attention, once given, always expected something in return. She laughed it off, but the seed had already lodged where doubt tends to fester. The first fracture in her marriage became visible only after it was too late to repair. Charles made a decision without consulting her. A public move that restructured certain holdings and quietly reduced her access to information she had grown accustomed to controlling. And when she protested, she was reminded gently, publicly, that her role had always been ceremonial. The humiliation was not the loss itself, but the way it was delivered, framed as efficiency rather than correction, and Lillian's reaction was immediate and disastrous. Her composure slipping in front of people who were not obligated to forget what they saw. Apologies followed, staged and insincere. But something essential had shifted, and once the Ashcrofts recognized instability, they did not attempt to soothe it. They contained it. Matthew did not need to intervene. By the time Lillian's behavior began drawing the wrong kind of attention, the narrative had already been set, her volatility contextualized as stress, her missteps reframed as evidence of unsuitability rather than provocation, and when consequences arrived, they were framed as protections rather than punishments. Reduced appearances, fewer responsibilities, increased supervision disguised as concern. Charles supported these measures publicly while withdrawing privately, his affection replaced by a politeness that felt more damning than anger. Lillian endured for as long as endurance could be mistaken for strength, but isolation has a way of sharpening desperation into recklessness, and she began making choices that confirmed every doubt already circulating quietly among those who mattered. The night she tried to corner me again, the setting was different, but the intent was familiar. She chose a place with height, with openness, with the illusion of privacy that comes from believing no one would interfere. And she spoke quickly, her words tumbling over each other as she accused me of orchestrating her downfall, of aligning myself with Matthew in ways she could not access, of stealing futures that should have been hers by right. There was a wildness to her now, a frantic quality that stripped her elegance of credibility, and when she moved closer, I did not step back. I had learned by then that resistance only feeds narratives of guilt, that stillness unsettles far more effectively. What she did not realize was that she was no longer acting in a vacuum, that her movements were already anticipated, her instability documented, her reach shortened in ways she could not perceive from inside her own panic. When authority intervened, it did so without drama. Hands appeared. Voices remained calm. Lillian was restrained not as a criminal but as a liability, escorted away with assurances that sounded compassionate until you listened closely enough to hear the finality beneath them. She screamed my name once, then Charles's, then fell silent when she realized neither would answer. The story that followed was tidy, controlled, designed to satisfy public curiosity while concealing the mechanisms that had made the outcome inevitable. And within weeks, her presence was reduced to a footnote. Her absence normalized with remarkable speed. Matthew and I did not discuss it. We did not need to. Power, once consolidated, does not require acknowledgement between those who understand its language. He began transferring authority incrementally, always framed as delegation rather than abdication, and by the time anyone noticed the shift, reversing it would have required admitting mistakes no one was willing to claim. I took my place without ceremony, my decisions accepted without debate, my name spoken with the careful respect reserved for permanence rather than popularity. Matthew remained beside me, not diminished but clarified, his role evolving into something quieter and far more dangerous, a constant presence whose loyalty was unmistakable, and whose expectations, now aligned with mine, no longer required explanation. Lillian was released years later, diminished, emptied of the urgency that had once defined her, and she vanished with the efficiency of someone no longer worth tracking. No one searched. No one speculated. Silence settled where her voice had once dominated, and the world adjusted without effort. I sometimes think about the room where agreements are made, how unchanged it remains, how many lives pass through it believing they are choosing rather than being arranged. When Matthew asks me whether I regret anything, his voice steady, his gaze intent, I answer honestly. Only that I ever believed survival required mercy.